Hello, Seahawks. Today you're going to be taking notes on 2.4 multiplying and dividing rational numbers. Here's your notes page. Make sure you write everything down that I write down from the video onto your notes page. You should have this. Okay, so what you're going to learn is that you are going to multiply rational numbers, fractions and decimals, and you're also going to be dividing fractions and decimals. Okay, so looking at these first two, what this is, you've learned how to multiply and divide fractions and decimals in elementary school, and in the beginning of the year you learned your multiplying and dividing of your integer rules. So let's just review those. When you have an even number of negatives, your answer is positive. When you have an odd number of negatives, your answer is negative. And you should remember that. We just learned that. We've been reviewing that. Okay, so if you look at number one, on number one you have two negatives. Two negatives. And the number is 2, is an even number. So my answer here is going to be a positive answer. Okay, that's all we're asking you to do on this first part. It says to determine whether the expression is positive or negative without evaluating. On number 2, I have a negative and a negative. Again, I have two negative numbers. 2 is even. So my answer for number 2 is also positive. Okay, number 3 we have division. I'm sorry, number 1 I didn't talk about. You have division on number 1. We've discussed how that's a form of division. On number 2 we were multiplying. Remember, division and multiplication of positive and negative numbers is you count up your negatives. An even number is positive, an odd number is negative. On number 3 we have division again, division. So we have 1 negative there. The number 1 is odd, so my answer here is going to be negative. Okay, and then we have number 4. We have 2 positive. I'm sorry, we do not have 2 positive. We have 2 negatives. Hold on one sec. Two is even, so our answer here is positive. Can't really fit my whole word there, so I abbreviated here. Okay, and that's all you had to do for 1 through 4. So that's reviewing your positive and negative rules when you're multiplying and dividing. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and multiply the rational numbers, which again, you have already learned how to multiply and divide rational numbers. You've learned how to multiply fractions, you've learned how to multiply decimals, you've learned how to divide fractions, you've learned how to divide decimals, but you may have forgotten. So here's a review for you. The only difference here on number 5 from what you learned when you were in 5th grade was I have a negative number here. So I have 1 negative, so my answer is going to be negative. Okay, now when you're multiplying rational numbers, we have 2 options. You can multiply straight across, okay, so we can do 3 times 10, we'll put the negative there again, which is 30, and 5 times 7, which is 35, and then you could go ahead and simplify that. 30 and 35 are both divisible by 5, so 30 divided by 5 is 6, and 35 divided by 5 is 7. And then that's your final answer. You always do simplify it. Okay, then you have another option. I'm going to rewrite this problem. Okay, we aren't going to go do away with that x, but for now we will see it in your textbook and stuff. Okay, but the other option is, again, my answer is going to be negative. That does not change, but you can also do what I call cross-canceling, okay? And cross-canceling is going to come in handy. So I would advise you to cross-cancel when you can, especially when we have a whole bunch of rational numbers that we are multiplying. Okay, and what that means is if you look across here at these two numbers, 10 and 5 are both divisible by 5. So I can simplify, you could call it, cross cancel, whatever you want to call that, okay? 5 divided by 5 is 1. 10 divided by 5 is 2. And then 3 and 7, I can't cross cancel there because 3 and 7 are only divisible by 1. So now I could just multiply across. 3 times 2 is 6, and 1 times 7 is 7. And there is the negative there. I'll rewrite it in the same color. Okay, so you get the same answer either way. Cross-canceling is a little bit easier, especially when you have large numbers. This way you could do the multiplication in your head. Okay, when you have a mixed number, like you do on number 6, you would need to change that to an improper fraction. So I have 5 halves, and I'm going to multiply that by negative. We do 9 times 2, which is 18, plus 4, which is 22, and you put it over the same denominator, 22 over 9. Okay, we have one negative, so my answer here is going to be negative. And I'm going to cross cancel, because in my opinion, I'd rather cross cancel than multiply. 5 times 22 isn't that difficult, but then I am going to have to simplify my problem. If I cross cancel, I'm not going to have to simplify. So I'm going to go ahead. 2 and 22 are both divisible by 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. 22 divided by 2 is 11. Now I could just multiply straight across. We have, I'm going to keep my negative there. 5 times 11 is 55, and 9 times 1 is 9. I'm going to rewrite that in another color. And you can leave that fraction just like that, as long as it is simplified. This is a simplified fraction. It's an improper fraction, which is totally fine, okay? But it is simplified. 55 and 9 are not divisible by anything other than 1, so you can leave it. If you insist on changing it back to a mixed number, you can, but you don't have to. I would just leave it. Okay, this next one we have negative 1 and 1/8 squared. So basically, that means negative 1 and 1/8 times negative 1 and 1/8. Okay, it is in the parentheses, so the whole negative 1 and 1/8 is squared. So I have two negatives, so my answer is a positive. I don't even have to worry about the negatives anymore. Now you need to change those mixed numbers into improper fractions. So 8 times 1 is 8, plus 1 is 9. So that's going to be a 9/8, and it's going to be a 9/8 again. Right? Same thing. 9/8 times 9/8. We already determined that my answer is positive because I have two negatives, so I don't even need my negatives there anymore. I can't cross cancel, so 9 times 9 is 81, and 8 times 8 is 64. And that is a simplified improper fraction, so I am going to leave it just like that. You do not need to change it back into a mixed number. Okay, and then this last one, we're multiplying decimals. Again, we have two negatives, so my answer is going to be a positive. You don't have to worry about that anymore. And when I multiply decimals, I always put the larger amount of digits on top. You do not have to line up your decimals when you're multiplying decimals. You only have to do that when you're adding and subtracting. So I'm just going to I don't have to line it up at all. It's basically you're multiplying 206 times 57. So 7 times 6 is 42. 7 times 0 is 0, plus 4. 7 times 2 is 14. You can put your placeholder here. 5 times 6 is 30. 5 times 0 is 0, plus 3. And 5 times 2 is 10. And then you add that up. 2 plus 0 is 2. 4 plus 0 is 4. 4 plus 3 is 7. 1 plus 0 is 1. And 1 plus 0 is 1. And then you count to see how many places you're going to move that decimal. We have 1, 2, 3. So I'm going to start here. 1, 2, 3. And that's where my decimal will go. So the answer here is a positive 11.742. 11 and 742 thousandths. And that's multiplying rational numbers. Now let's move on to dividing. So when you are dividing fractions, we actually don't divide fractions. You actually multiply by the reciprocal. Now the reciprocal, if you look here, we have a over b. The reciprocal of a over b is b over a. So you basically are just flipping the fraction. Some of you may have learned keep, change, flip. I think that's what you might have been taught to do, and that's just fine if that helps you remember. You're actually multiplying by the reciprocal, okay? So if keep, change, flip helps you remember that, that's totally fine. Keep, change, change, because you are changing it. Just remember what you're doing to it. You're not changing it to the opposite, but you are flipping it. You are taking the reciprocal. Now, you always keep your first fraction. So you keep your original fraction. You change, and if you want to do this, you could, okay? You change your division to multiplication, and then you're going to multiply by the reciprocal. So the reciprocal of 10 over 9 is 9 over 10. Now that vocabulary word reciprocal, you need to know that, okay? We don't divide fractions, we multiply by the reciprocal. Okay, so now on this problem, and not my positives and negatives stay, okay? So if 10/9 was negative, it would be a negative 9 over 10. You keep your negative stays, okay? Actually, in the very beginning of the problem, you could determine if your answer is positive or negative. I have one negative, so my answer is going to be negative no matter what, okay? Now, you could do your cross-canceling if you'd like. Both 9 and 9 are both divisible by 9. So 9 divided by 9 is 1. 9 divided by 9 is 1. You could do that. They cross-cancel each other out. You can also cross-cancel out the 2 and the 10. 2 and 10 are both divisible by 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. 10 divided by 2 is 5. And then you could just multiply straight across. We already determined my answer was negative. 1 times 1 is 1. And 1 times 5 is 5. Negative 1/5 is your answer. Now, if you didn't go ahead and do the cross-canceling, we had negative 2/9 times 9/10. There are times where I won't even show this to you because I don't feel like doing that math. I'd rather cross-cancel. It's so much easier. But if you just wanted to multiply straight across, 2 times 9 is 18. 9 times 10 is 90. And then you would have to simplify that. Now, you don't probably know off the top of your head that 18 goes into 90 5 times, but I do, but I'm pretty sure that a lot of you might not know that. So you might divide this and say, well, 18 and 9 are both divisible by 9. 18 divided by 9 is 2. 9 divided by 90 is 10. And then you would go one more time with the negative 1/5. I don't know if you would get to the negative 1/5 right off the top. So the cross-canceling works well, or you could just multiply straight across, but then you must simplify it. You cannot leave your fraction unsimplified. Okay, you can leave it as an improper fraction if it's simplified, but you cannot leave it not simplified. Okay, for some reason, I don't know if all of you think this way, but my son had an argument with me about it, saying that an improper fraction isn't simplified. An improper fraction can be simplified, okay? Okay, let's look at number 2. Okay, now for this problem, it is 2/3 divided by negative, and it's really any number can be written over 1. Okay, now I like to write it over 1, whether you do it right on the problem like this, or you rewrite it, because you need to know what the reciprocal of negative 16 over 1 is. Okay, so now we're not going to divide the fraction. We are going to multiply by the reciprocal. So we are going to keep our 2/3. We're going to change our division to multiplication. And the reciprocal of negative 16 over 1 is still a negative 1 over 16. Okay, and then you could go ahead and you could cross-cancel if you want. First of all, I have one negative, so my answer is going to be negative. 2 and 16 are both divisible by 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. 16 divided by 2 is 8. And then you can multiply straight across. 1 times 1 is 1, and 3 times 8 is 24. You might not know 3 times 16 off the top of your head. Okay, so you could multiply straight across and then simplify. Let me just show you that just in case you want to, but I don't advise it. Okay, you would still get a negative. 1 times 2 is 2. 3 times 16, not so sure, 48. You might need to think about it for a second. And then you need to simplify negative 2/48. They're both divisible by 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. 48 divided by 2 is 24. So in the end, you still get to the same answer. You just need to make sure you simplify it. Either way is fine with me. Okay, and then we have this last one where we're dividing decimals. Okay, we have 2 negatives, so my answer, 2 is an even number, so my answer is a positive number. And you could divide decimals just like you divide numbers. 0.72 divided by 0.9. I don't have to worry about the negatives anymore because I've already determined my answer is positive. Okay, when you have the decimal outside like this, you can't divide by a decimal when your divisor there. So you have to move that decimal once to the right. If you move that decimal once to the right, you have to move this decimal once to the right, okay? So now I'm going to put my decimal right up here. So now 7 doesn't divide by 9. That would be a 0. 72 divided by 9 is 8. 8 times 9 is 72. And that's your answer, positive 0.8. Now, you may also see problems like this written. I'm going to forget the negatives now because it doesn't matter. We already know my answer is positive. Okay? And what you could look at this as, you could just look at this and you can't leave decimals in a fraction. Okay? And this also means division, doesn't it? Okay? So what I could do is I could move the decimal out of here. If I move the decimal to the right 2 times, I now have 72. If I move the decimal to the right here, if I move the decimal to the right on my numerator, I have to do the same on my denominator. So I have 72 over 90. Okay? You can do that, but then you would just have to simplify that. 72 and 90 are both divisible by, you might come up with 9 right off the top of your head, possibly. Maybe something less, maybe something more. I'm going to go with 9. 72 divided by 9 is 8. 90 divided by 9 is 10. Oh, I got to simplify a little bit more. 8 tenths, but look at 8 tenths we have there, right? And what is this? 8 tenths. Okay, but when we write that as a fraction, you wouldn't leave it as 8 tenths. 8 and 10 are both divisible by 2. 8 divided by 2 is 4. 10 divided by 2 is 5. So 4/5 would be your final answer. 4/5 written as a decimal is 8 tenths. Okay, so either way you want to do that, both of those answers would be acceptable. Okay, whatever you're more comfortable with. If you have any questions, please write them down, and I will see you in class. Have a good night.